The wind owned this stretch of prairie, a ceaseless tyrant that scoured the land and stripped the warmth from a man's bones. It whipped dust into the corners of tired eyes and carried the scent of a long, hard winter that refused to die. Against this wind, a woman stood, her body a thin line of defiance before the raw lumber facade of the town's only mercantile. A small boy, no older than 5, clung to the folds of her worn skirt, his face buried in the coarse fabric as if to hide from the cold and the harsh words battering his mother. "Please, Mr. Harding, just a sack of flour. Some beans. He hasn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days." Her voice was low, worn as smooth as a river stone, yet it barely carried over the wind's mournful howl. The man in the doorway, a portly figure framed by sacks of grain and hanging tins, crossed his thick arms over his chest. His face, a fleshy map of suspicion and petty authority, was unmoved. "Credit's a privilege, ma'am, not a right. The ledger says you're good for nothing. We'll work it off. I can scrub floors, muck stalls, anything." The desperation was a tremor in her voice, a slight shaking of her shoulders that she fought to control. She would not beg. She would not break in front of her son. The whole town's full of folks willing to work. Folks who pay their accounts. He made a shooing motion with his hand, a gesture of final, dismissive power. "Now get along. You're blocking the door for paying customers." He turned his back, a clear signal that the conversation was over, and disappeared into the cluttered warmth of his store. The woman, Lena, did not move for a long moment. The rejection settled over her like a shroud, heavier than the cold. She looked down at the top of her son's head, at the fine, dust-colored hair, and a wave of failure so profound it threatened to buckle her knees washed over her. The silence that followed the storekeeper's dismissal was louder than his words, filled with the vast indifference of the landscape and the hollow ache in her belly. What was left when dignity was all you had, and it bought you nothing? Across the dusty street, a man leaned against the support post of the livery stable, his hat pulled low against the wind. He had been watching, not with the idle curiosity of the few other souls braving the street, but with a stillness that seemed to absorb the scene without judgment. His name was Elias, and his face was a geography of solitude, carved by sun and silence. He'd seen her arrive in town a week prior, a ghost with a child, looking for work that didn't exist for a woman alone. He'd seen the hope drain from her posture day by day, leaving only the rigid spine of a survivor. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of a creature caught in a trap, gnawing at its own leg to get free. He saw the boy shiver, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook his small frame. It was a simple thing, a child's cold, but it broke through the calloused shell Elias had built around his heart. It was a memory, sharp and unwelcome, of another child, another fever, another helpless, shivering tremor that he had been powerless to stop. The guilt, a constant, sleeping companion, stirred within him. He pushed himself off the post, his movements economical and deliberate. The jingle of his spurs was a dull, metallic sound against the wind's cry. He crossed the street, his long shadow falling over the woman and child before they even saw him approach. Lena looked up, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear, the fear of the unknown, of a man whose intentions were unreadable. He was tall and broad, his presence blocking out the wind for a moment. He stopped before her, his gaze not on her, but on the boy. He didn't offer sympathy or kind words. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "Come with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a simple, flat command. Yet beneath the gruffness lay a strange sort of reprieve. Lena stared at him, suspicion warring with the raw, animal need to protect her child from the cold, from the hunger, from the world personified by Mr. Harding. She saw nothing in the stranger's face to trust, no smile, no pity. There was only a stark, unyielding resolve. But in that resolve there was a strange sort of safety. He had seen her humiliation and had not looked away. He had not mocked her. He had simply acted. For her son, Samuel, who was now looking up at the tall man with wide, curious eyes. She took the smallest of steps forward. A single nod was her only answer. A quiet surrender to a fate she could not predict, because any direction was better than standing still in the biting wind, starving. A quiet journey was about to begin, not of miles, but of the vast, uncharted territory between two solitary hearts. The walk out of town was a silent procession. Elias led the way, his long strides eating up the dusty ground. Lena followed a few paces behind, one hand holding fast to Samuel's, the other clutching the thin shawl tight around her shoulders. The wind was at their backs now, pushing them onward into the vast, open country that stretched to a horizon the color of slate. The town, with its single street and its hard-hearted men, shrank behind them until it was just a collection of insignificant boxes on the immense canvas of the plains. Lena felt a tremor of fear. She was walking away from the only semblance of civilization for miles, following a man she did not know to a place she could not imagine. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But back to what? To starvation? To the cold mercy of the church charity box that was always empty by the time she got to it? She tightened her grip on Samuel's hand. He was the only reason she kept walking forward. He was her compass and her courage. Elias's homestead was nestled in a shallow basin, sheltered by a small clutch of cottonwoods that rattled their bare branches like bones in the wind. The cabin was small, built of sturdy, axe-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw. A curl of smoke, pale against the gray sky, rose from a stone chimney, a fragile signal of life in the immense emptiness. A barn, weathered to the same silver gray as the dead grass, stood a short distance away, and a split-rail corral held two horses that watched their approach with placid interest. The place felt isolated, a world unto itself, governed by the seasons and the silence. It was clean, orderly, but profoundly lonely. Elias pushed open the heavy plank door and stood aside, holding it for them to enter. The warmth from inside rushed out to greet them, a welcome shock after the relentless cold. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. The interior was a single room, sparse and functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling on the hearth. A sturdy table with two chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, occupied one corner, and a dry sink with a bucket of water another. But what drew Lena's eye, what seemed to hold all the cabin's unspoken history, was a single wooden rocking chair sitting near the hearth. It was empty. It looked as if it had been empty for a very long time. Elias closed the door, shutting out the wind. The sudden quiet was thick, heavy with unspoken questions. He moved to the fireplace and added a log, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He did not look at her as he spoke. "You can stay," he said, his back still to her. "There's work. The place needs a woman's hand. You cook, clean. I'll provide board." It was a business proposition stated in the plainest terms. There was no charity in his voice, and for that, Lena was grateful. Charity was a debt that could never be repaid. Work, however, was a currency she understood. She could earn her keep. She could hold her head up. Still, the suspicion lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. Men did not offer help without expecting something in return, something she was not willing to give. She found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Why?" Elias turned from the fire. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers for the first time. The gaze was direct, unwavering, and held a deep, ancient sadness that startled her. He looked past her, at Samuel, who was staring at the fire, his small face mesmerized by the dancing flames, his cheeks already flushed with the cabin's warmth. "The boy was cold," he said, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. He gestured toward the table. "There's stew in the pot, bread in the box. Feed him." With that, he picked up a heavy sheepskin coat from a peg by the door and went back outside, leaving her alone with her son in the sudden, overwhelming warmth of the stranger's home. Lena stood frozen for a moment, the man's words echoing in the silence. The boy was cold. It was an anchor, a single, solid reason in a sea of uncertainty. She looked at Samuel, who was now rubbing his small, empty stomach. His hunger was a more immediate and powerful force than her fear. She moved slowly, cautiously, as if in a stranger's dream. She took off Samuel's thin coat and her own shawl, hanging them on an empty peg. She led him to the table and sat him on a chair. She found the pot of stew on the hearth, thick with meat and vegetables, and ladled a steaming portion into a tin bowl. She found the bread box and tore off a hunk of dark, heavy bread. She placed it all in front of her son, and watched as he ate with a desperate, single-minded focus that broke her heart. He did not speak, did not even look up until the bowl was clean. Only then did Lena allow herself to breathe. She looked around the small cabin again. At the neat stack of firewood, the clean-swept floor, the empty rocking chair. It was a place of solitude, a place of deep, abiding quiet. It was not a home, not yet, but it was safe. It was warm, and there was food. For now, for her son, that was more than enough. She pulled the other chair to the table, not to eat, but simply to sit near her boy, to watch the rise and fall of his small chest as he breathed in the warm, safe air. She had made her choice on the dusty street, and this was the consequence. She stayed. The first morning dawned cold and clear. When Lena awoke from a restless sleep on a pallet of blankets Elias had laid for her by the fire, he was already gone. A fresh log smoldered on the hearth, pushing a steady warmth into the room, and a pot of coffee was brewing, its bitter, earthy scent filling the cabin. It was a silent offering, a gesture that spoke of routine and a life lived alone. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Samuel, who was still deeply asleep, burrowed under the heavy quilt on the main bed. Elias had insisted they take it, and had made his own bedroll near the door without a word of discussion. Lena understood that her new life would be defined by actions, not words. Elias had laid out the unspoken rules of their arrangement. When he returned from the barn near mid-morning, smelling of hay and horse, he did not greet her. He simply nodded, took a tin cup from a hook, filled it with coffee, and sat at the table to mend a piece of tack. His silence was not hostile. It was a wall, thick and high, built of things she could not guess at. And so she built her own wall in return, a wall of ceaseless work. She set about proving her worth. She swept the floor until the planks were free of every speck of dust. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the fireplace. She found a sack of potatoes and onions in a small root cellar beneath a trapdoor and made a thick, savory soup for their midday meal. She worked with a quiet, desperate efficiency, her movements quick and sure. She was carving out her place in this silent house, making herself indispensable. She kept Samuel close, giving him small tasks, gathering kindling, wiping the table, to keep his hands busy and his mind off the strangeness of their new reality. He was a quiet child by nature, made more so by the hardships they had endured. He watched Elias with a child's open curiosity, unafraid but wary. Elias, in turn, watched her. As he worked the leather strap in his hands, his eyes would occasionally lift, taking in the way she moved, the efficiency of her labor, the protective curve of her back as she bent over her son. He noted the careful way she rationed the flour, the way she saved every scrap of vegetable for the stockpot. He saw the deep, weary lines around her eyes, the ingrained caution in her posture. She was like a wild thing he'd brought in from the cold, wary of the hand that fed it, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He understood that. He had his own ghosts, his own reasons for keeping the world at arm's length. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun and the rhythm of their shared chores. A routine began to form, a silent dance of two solitary people orbiting the small space of the cabin. He would rise before dawn, tend to the stock and work the land. She would rise with the light, tend the fire, cook, clean, and mend. They ate their meals in silence at the small table. The scrape of a fork against a tin plate, the crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind outside. These were the sounds of their life together. The silence was a language all its own. It spoke of their separate pasts, of hurts too deep for words, It was a space they both respected, a neutral ground where neither had to explain or pretend. One afternoon, while mending one of Samuel's torn shirts, Lena noticed Elias watching her from the doorway. He had been splitting wood, and the axe was still in his hand. His gaze was fixed on her hands, on the nimble movement of the needle and thread. She paused, her fingers still, feeling the weight of his stare. He said nothing, his face as impassive as ever, but in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something. A memory, a sadness, before he turned and went back to his work. The sound of the axe splitting would resume, a steady, percussive beat that was the only answer to her unasked question. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was not the first woman to sit and sew by this fire. The empty rocking chair seemed to creak in agreement. Trust was a seed planted in frozen ground. It had not yet begun to thaw. The weeks passed in a succession of gray, windswept days. The routine Elias and Lena had established became as fixed as the horizon, a silent contract that governed their lives. Yet, within this rigid framework of work and silence, small, almost imperceptible shifts began to occur. They were gestures as quiet as the landscape, but they spoke volumes. One morning, Lena went to the woodpile and found the axe had been sharpened to a razor's edge, its handle smoothed and oiled. It made her task of splitting kindling infinitely easier. Elias never mentioned it. Another day, she noticed the persistent drip from the water bucket had ceased. Upon inspection, she found a new leather washer, expertly fitted, sealing the leak. He had fixed it while she and Samuel were out gathering dried brush, a silent act of maintenance that was also an act of care. She began to see his handiwork everywhere. A loose floorboard nailed down, a drafty crack in the wall chinked with fresh mud, a wobbly leg on her chair braced and made steady. He moved through their shared space like a quiet guardian, mending the world around them without ever drawing attention to himself. Lena, in turn, found her own ways to breach the silence. She began to save him the last cup of coffee in the morning, leaving it warming by the hearth for when he came in from the cold. She took his worn work shirts and mended the frayed cuffs and collars with tiny, almost invisible stitches. She learned the way he liked his stew, thick, with plenty of potatoes, and ensured there was always a hot meal waiting for him at the end of his long day. These were not offerings of affection, not yet. They were acknowledgments, a quiet dialogue of mutual respect paid in the currency of labor and forethought. The true turning point, however, came because of Samuel. The boy, having grown more comfortable in his new surroundings, had taken to exploring the small world around the cabin. His prized possession was a small, broken tin soldier he had found near the abandoned well, a relic of some other child, some other time. He would spend hours with it, creating silent battles in the dust. Elias often watched him from a distance, a strange, pensive expression on his face. One day, Elias had to ride out to check the fence lines at the far end of his property. He was gone from sunup to sundown. When he returned, long after dark had fallen, he was weary and covered in dust. He ate his supper in his usual silence and then sat by the fire, his hands busy with a small block of cottonwood and a sharp pocketknife. Lena watched him out of the corner of her eye as she cleaned up, the rhythmic scrape of the blade on wood a soothing sound in the quiet cabin. She assumed he was mending some piece of equipment. The next morning, after Elias had already left for the barn, Samuel let out a small gasp of delight. There, on the windowsill where his tin soldier usually stood guard, was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird. Its wings were slightly swept back as if in flight, and the details, though simple, were rendered with a surprising delicacy. It was a perfect, beautiful thing. Samuel picked it up, his small fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. He looked at his mother, his eyes wide with a question she could not answer. When Elias came in for breakfast, Samuel walked over to him, the bird held carefully in his cupped hands. He held it up for the tall, silent man to see. Elias looked down at the offering, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded once, a curt, almost dismissive gesture, and went to pour his coffee. But Lena saw it. She saw the way his calloused fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second before gripping the tin cup. She saw the faint softening around his mouth. It was the first crack in the wall, the first undeniable proof of a heart that was not made of stone. She took the small bird from Samuel and placed it back on the windowsill, a new guardian for their small, fragile world. As she did, she glanced outside. The sky to the west was a bruised, heavy purple. The wind had picked up, and it no longer sighed around the cabin. It moaned, a low, mournful sound that promised a change. A storm was brewing on the horizon, a physical manifestation of the turbulent, unspoken emotions stirring within the cabin's warm walls. The ground was not just thawing. It was beginning to break apart. The storm did not wait for an invitation. It descended upon them that evening, a furious blizzard that swallowed the world in a blinding chaos of wind and snow. The temperature plummeted, and the wind shrieked like a banshee, clawing at the cabin, seeking any crack or crevice through which to invade their small pocket of warmth. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a defiant beast battling the cold that pressed in from all sides. They were marooned, an island of light and heat in a vast, frozen sea. It was in this maelstrom that Samuel began to cough. At first, it was a small, dry hack, but as the night wore on, it deepened, becoming a ragged, chest-rattling sound that filled the small cabin. Lena put him to bed, piling extra blankets on top of him, but his shivering wouldn't stop. When she laid a hand on his forehead, the heat she felt sent a jolt of pure terror through her. It was a dry, searing heat that spoke of a raging fever. Lena's carefully constructed composure crumbled. This was her deepest fear realized. Alone, miles from any town or doctor, with her son's life hanging in the balance while the world raged outside. She bathed his face with a damp cloth. She whispered soothing words, but the fever only climbed. Samuel's breathing grew shallow and rapid, and he began to murmur deliriously, his small body tossing and turning beneath the heavy quilts. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her heart. She was helpless. It was Elias who took control. He had been watching from his seat by the fire, his usual stillness replaced by a tense, focused energy. He rose and came to the bedside, his large frame casting a long shadow in the flickering firelight. He gently pushed Lena aside, his touch surprisingly firm but not unkind. "Get more water on the fire," he commanded, his voice low and steady, cutting through the fog of her fear. "And fetch the small leather pouch from my saddlebag." Lena moved without thinking, her body obeying the calm authority in his voice. While she worked, Elias stripped Samuel of his sweat-soaked nightshirt. He dipped cloths into the basin of cool water she brought and began to sponge the boy's burning skin, his movements methodical and sure. He worked with a quiet competence that was both astonishing and deeply comforting. This was not unfamiliar territory for him. When she brought him the leather pouch, he opened it and took out a small bundle of dried leaves and bark. "Willow bark," he said, his first unsolicited explanation since she had arrived. "Brings the fever down." He crushed the bark in his hands and dropped it into a cup of boiling water, letting it steep into a dark, bitter tea. He lifted Samuel's head, cradling it in the crook of his large arm. "Easy now, son," he murmured, his voice softer than Lena had ever heard it. He coaxed the boy to drink the tea, a few sips at a time. For the rest of the night, he did not leave the bedside. He kept the cool cloths on Samuel's forehead. He forced small amounts of water and tea between his lips, and he simply sat there, his large, rough hand resting gently on the boy's small chest, as if he could will the fever away through sheer force of presence. Lena watched him, her own exhaustion a heavy weight in her limbs. She saw him not as a gruff, silent stranger, but as a protector. In the dim, flickering light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften, and the deep sadness in his eyes looked less like a wall and more like a wound. She saw a man who had known this particular brand of fear before, a man who was intimately acquainted with the helplessness of watching a child suffer. Sometime before dawn, utterly spent, Lena slumped into the wooden chair by the fire and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She didn't mean to, didn't want to leave her post, but her body betrayed her. When she awoke, the first pale, gray light of morning was filtering through the snow-caked window. The storm had quieted to a whisper. The first thing she heard was the steady, even sound of breathing from the bed. She rushed over. Samuel was sleeping peacefully, the frantic tossing replaced by a deep stillness. She laid a trembling hand on his forehead. It was cool. The fever had broken. Relief so powerful it felt like a physical blow washed over her, and she nearly collapsed. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked up and saw Elias, still sitting in the same spot by the bed. He looked haggard, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes were clear. He had kept vigil all night while she slept. He had guarded her son. He had saved him. In that moment, something inside her shifted irrevocably. She had arrived at this cabin out of desperation, stayed out of necessity, and worked out of pride. But now, for the first time, she looked at this silent, solitary man and felt a profound, heart-altering surge of gratitude. For the first time, she felt safe. The passing of the storm left the world transformed. A thick blanket of pristine snow covered everything, muffling all sound and reflecting the pale winter sun with a blinding intensity. The world outside was hushed, still, and clean. Inside the cabin, a similar transformation had taken place. The crisis of the blizzard and Samuel's fever had scoured the air between Elias and Lena, washing away the sharp edges of their caution and leaving behind a new, softer silence. It was no longer a silence of suspicion, but one of shared experience, of a battle fought and won together. Samuel recovered quickly, his child's resilience a small miracle. Within a day, he was sitting up in bed, clutching the wooden bird Elias had carved for him. Elias, for his part, retreated back into his quiet routines, but something had changed in his demeanor. He would let his gaze linger on the boy for a moment longer than necessary, and once, Lena saw him reach out and gently ruffle Samuel's hair as he passed by the bed. The gesture was so fleeting, so uncharacteristic, that she wondered if she had imagined it. A few days after the storm, as life settled back into its rhythm, Lena was standing at the hearth, stirring a pot of thin rabbit stew. The larder was running low after their confinement, but the simple, savory smell was comforting. Samuel was on the floor, quietly pushing his wooden bird through imaginary snowdrifts on the rag rug. The cabin was warm and peaceful. It was in this quiet moment that Lena found the courage to speak. Her voice was low, not much more than a breath, directed at the simmering pot rather than at Elias, who sat at the table oiling a harness. His father, he had no patience for sickness, said it was a weakness, said we were a burden he couldn't carry. She hadn't planned to say it. The words simply came, a release of a pressure she hadn't known she was holding. It wasn't a plea for sympathy, but a simple statement of fact, a piece of her past offered up into the quiet air. Elias's hands stilled their work on the leather. He did not look at her. He stared at the harness in front of him, his knuckles white where he gripped the strap. The silence stretched, and Lena felt a flush of regret, wishing she could call the words back. Perhaps she had presumed too much, mistaken his kindness for a desire for closeness. But then he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. A child ain't a burden. A child is a promise. He said nothing more. He picked up his oil rag and resumed his work, the rhythmic motion a signal that the conversation was over. But his words hung in the air, a profound and simple truth that settled over Lena's heart like a warm blanket. He understood. Later that week it was his turn. He was standing by the window, looking out at the vast, snow-covered landscape. The empty rocking chair stood between him and Lena. For a long time he just stood there, his back to her, lost in a thought she couldn't fathom. Without turning, he spoke to the glass. "Had a girl once," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. "Sarah. She had hair the color of corn silk." He paused, and the silence was filled with the weight of that one, simple name. "Lost her to the lung fever, the winter of '78. My wife, she followed her that spring." said the world was too quiet without Sarah's laughter. He finally turned, and his eyes met Lena's. The grief in them was a raw, open thing, a landscape as desolate as the winter plains outside. This place has been quiet ever since. Lena's heart ached for him, for the immensity of his loss. She finally understood the empty rocking chair, the profound solitude, the wall he had built around himself. It wasn't a wall to keep the world out. It was a memorial, built stone by silent stone, to the family he had lost. She could offer no words of comfort that wouldn't sound hollow and cheap. So she offered the only thing she had, her own quiet understanding. She gave him a slow, single nod, a mirror of the gesture he had given her so many times. It was an acknowledgement of his pain, a silent promise to respect the ghosts that inhabited his home. The bridge between them was no longer just a few tentative stones. It was becoming a solid, sturdy structure, built not of words, but of shared sorrows. As the snow began to melt under the strengthening sun, revealing the muddy, hopeful earth beneath, their supplies dwindled to almost nothing. The trip to town, which they had all silently dreaded, became an unavoidable necessity. The thought of facing Mr. Harding again, of enduring the curious and judgmental stares of the townspeople, filled Lena with a cold anxiety. She had found a sanctuary in Elias's cabin, a fragile piece she was loath to disturb. But Samuel needed milk, and they needed flour and salt. The morning of the trip, she dressed herself and Samuel in their cleanest, most mended clothes, a small act of defiance against the poverty she could not hide. She pulled her shawl tight, as if it were a suit of armor. Elias hitched the wagon, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as always, but Lena noticed a new tension in the set of his jaw. He was aware of her fear, and it seemed to settle on him as well. The ride into town was tense and silent. When they pulled up in front of the mercantile, the street seemed to fall quiet. Faces appeared in windows. Men standing outside the saloon stopped their conversations to watch. Lena felt their eyes on her like a physical weight. She was the woman who had appeared from nowhere, the woman who had left with the silent, reclusive Elias Thorne. Their imaginations, she knew, would have filled in the rest of the story with sordid, ugly details. "Stay in the wagon with the boy," Elias said, his voice low. "No," Lena replied, her own voice surprising her with its firmness. "We'll go in together. To hide in the wagon would be to admit shame." She would not let them think she was ashamed. She would face them for Samuel's sake, and for her own. Elias looked at her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. He lifted Samuel down from the wagon, and then turned and offered his hand to Lena. It was the first time he had ever done so. His hand was rough and calloused, but the grip was steady and strong. She took it, and together, the three of them walked toward the mercantile door, a strange, makeshift family bracing for a battle. The moment they stepped inside, the store fell silent. Mr. Harding was behind the counter, totaling up a farmer's purchase. He looked up, and a slow, malicious smile spread across his fleshy face. He ignored Elias completely, his eyes fixing on Lena with a look of smug triumph. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Look what the wind blew back in. Seems you found yourself a much better arrangement out on the prairie. Thorne's charity must be more generous than mine." He winked at one of the men leaning against a barrel of pickles. The implication was clear and ugly. Lena flinched as if struck. The blood drained from her face, and she instinctively pulled Samuel closer to her side, trying to shield him from the venom in the man's voice. She wanted to turn and run, to flee the suffocating judgment in the room. But Elias's hand was still on her arm, a firm, grounding pressure. He did not raise his voice. He did not react to Harding's jibe. He simply guided Lena to the counter and began placing items on it. A sack of flour, a bag of beans, coffee, sugar, a small tin of condensed milk. He moved with an unnerving calm that drew all the attention in the room. When he was done, he finally looked at Harding. His eyes were as cold and hard as river ice. The air crackled with a tension that was far more menacing than any shouted threat. "That all you'll be needin', Thorn?" Harding asked, his smirk faltering slightly under the weight of Elias's stare. Elias placed a few coins on the counter, more than enough to cover the cost. Then he looked directly at Harding, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the silent store. It was not a shout, but a declaration, a drawing of a line in the sand for all to see. "She's with me," he said. The 3 words were simple, unadorned, but they held the force of a legal decree. They were a shield, a claim, a final, unarguable statement of fact. She is not adrift. She is not alone. She belongs with me. He was not just defending her. He was publicly claiming her as his own under his protection. Harding's face paled. The sneer vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear. He quickly swept the coins into his drawer and began to bag the groceries, his movements suddenly clumsy. No one in the room dared to speak. Elias picked up the sacks, took Lena's arm again, and led her and Samuel out of the store. They walked back through the silent, staring crowd and climbed into the wagon. As they pulled away, leaving the town and its small-minded cruelty behind them, Lena looked at the stern, unyielding profile of the man beside her. He had not offered her pity or false comfort. He had given her something far more valuable. He had given her his name, his protection, his honor. He had stood between her and the world, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the ground solid beneath her feet. The ride back to the homestead was as silent as the ride into town had been, but the quality of the silence had changed completely. Before, it had been thick with anxiety and dread. Now it was a sanctuary, a protective space that held the 3 of them together. The ugly words spoken in the store could not penetrate it. Lena sat straight on the wagon seat. Samuel nestled between her and Elias, and watched the familiar landscape roll by. The cottonwood trees in the distance were no longer a sign of isolation, but a beacon of welcome. They were going home. When they arrived, the cabin seemed different, warmer, more solid. It was their fortress against the harshness of the world they had just left behind. As Elias unloaded the supplies, Lena took Samuel inside. She knelt and unwrapped his scarf, her fingers lingering on his soft cheek. He was safe. They were safe. The feeling was so new, so profound, it was almost painful. Life on the homestead found a new, deeper rhythm. The unspoken contract of board for work dissolved, replaced by the unstated, intuitive partnership of a family. They were no longer 2 solitary individuals sharing a roof out of necessity. They were a unit, working together to build a life from the prairie soil. The lines of their duties blurred. Lena found herself helping Elias in the barn, learning to milk their 1 cow and feed the chickens he had bought on a previous trip to a neighboring farm. He, in turn, would sometimes take over watching the stew or would sit with Samuel, showing him how to use a knife to strip the bark from a stick. With the arrival of true spring, Lena's attention turned to the earth. Behind the cabin was a small patch of ground that got good sun. Elias tilled it for her with a hand plow, his powerful shoulders straining against the stubborn soil, turning over the dark, rich earth. From a small cloth bag, she produced a handful of seeds, beans, squash, and corn, that she had carefully carried with her on her long journey, a tiny, hoarded piece of a future she had almost given up on. She let Samuel help her, showing him how to press the seeds into the soil and cover them over, teaching him the quiet faith of a farmer. Planting the garden was an act of hope, a belief in tomorrow, a statement that they were putting down roots. As the days grew longer and warmer, the sound of Samuel's laughter began to fill the air. It was a sound that had been absent for so long, Lena had almost forgotten its music. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on a line Elias had strung between 2 trees, she heard it, a pure, uninhibited peal of joy. She turned and saw Samuel chasing a bright yellow butterfly through the new grass, his small legs pumping, his face alight with a delight so simple and profound it made her own heart ache with happiness. Elias was near the corral, mending a fence post, and he had stopped his work, hammer in hand, to watch the boy. A small, slow smile touched his lips. It was the first time Lena had ever seen him truly smile, and it transformed his face, erasing the years of grief and solitude for a fleeting, beautiful moment. Their eyes met over the top of Samuel's laughing, dancing form. In that shared glance, a world of understanding passed between them. This was what they were building. Not just a homestead, but a place where a child could laugh without fear. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It had become a home. The days softened into summer, long and golden. The sun baked the land, and the prairie grasses grew tall, swaying in the gentle evening breeze. The garden Lena had planted thrived, its green vines and sturdy stalks a testament to their shared labor. The rhythm of their life was slow, deliberate, and deeply comforting. It was a life measured in rows hoed, buckets of water carried, and the quiet satisfaction of a pantry slowly filling with preserved food for the winter to come. One evening, after the heat of the day had broken, a familiar peace settled over the cabin. The fire on the hearth was low, more for light than for warmth, its flames casting flickering shadows on the log walls. Samuel was already asleep in the bed, his breathing soft and even in the quiet room. In his hand, he still clutched the small wooden bird, its surface worn smooth from constant handling. Elias sat at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a familiar, rhythmic sound. Lena sat in a chair nearby, a basket of mending on her lap. She was darning one of Samuel's socks, her needle weaving in and out of the worn fabric with practiced ease. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a comfortable presence, a shared space woven from 1,000 unspoken understandings. It was the silence of people who knew each other's habits, who could anticipate each other's needs without a word. From silence, warmth had come. It had not been a sudden blaze, but a slow, creeping heat, like the embers of a banked fire gradually reigniting. It was in the extra blanket he left on her pallet on a cold night. It was in the wildflower she had picked and placed in a jar of water on the windowsill, a small spot of color he never commented on but never disturbed. It was in the way he now waited for her to sit before he began to eat, a small but profound gesture of respect. Lena finished her mending, folding the small sock and placing it back in the basket. She looked at Elias, at the way the firelight caught the silver in his hair and softened the hard lines of his face. She thought of the man who had found her, broken and desperate, in the wind-blown street. He had offered her shelter. He had healed her son. He had defended her honor. He had given her a home. Her gaze drifted to the empty rocking chair that sat in its customary place by the hearth. It was the one piece of the cabin that still felt haunted by the past, a silent monument to his lost family. She had never sat in it, feeling it was not her place, that the ghosts of his wife and daughter still claimed it as their own. Slowly, she rose from her chair. Elias looked up from his work, his hands stilling as he watched her. She walked to the rocker, her heart beating a little faster. She hesitated for only a second, then turned and sank into it. The old wood groaned softly under her weight, a sound of gentle protest, and then settled into a slow, rhythmic creak as she pushed off with her foot. Creak, squeak, creak, squeak. It was a sound of domesticity, of life, of continuity. It was the sound of a home. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He saw her in the chair that had stood empty for a decade, a symbol of all he had lost. He had thought its emptiness was permanent, a part of him that could never be filled. But seeing her there now, her head leaning back, her eyes closed, the gentle motion stirring the quiet air, it did not bring the familiar stab of pain. Instead, a strange sense of rightness, of peace, settled over him. The ghosts were not gone, but they were no longer grieving. They were making room. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that this, too, was as it should be. He set aside his rifle, the work for the night finished. A chapter had closed, and a new one, quiet and full of unspoken promise, had begun. The rocker creaked on, a gentle lullaby in the heart of the silent prairie. The seasons turned, cycling through the prairie's subtle but profound transformations. The gold of summer gave way to the crisp, russet tones of autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the wind once again began to keen around the corners of the cabin. But this time, it was a familiar song, not a threat. Inside, the warmth was not just from the fire, but from the life they had built within the four log walls. The shelves were heavy with jars of preserved beans and squash from their garden. The scent of drying herbs hung from the rafters. It was a home, provisioned against the coming winter not just with food, but with a quiet, resilient strength. One evening at dusk, Elias stood on the small porch he had built, leaning against a post and watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of deep orange and purple. The air was cool and carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. He was no longer just a man surviving on his land. He was a man at peace with his world. The profound solitude that had defined him for so long had been replaced by a different kind of quiet, one that was shared, one that was full. The cabin door opened behind him, and Lena stepped out onto the porch. She moved with a new ease, her posture no longer braced against the world, but settled and confident. She carried a tin cup of steaming coffee, which she held out to him. He took it, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. It was a simple, everyday gesture, one of many that now made up the fabric of their lives, yet it held a universe of intimacy. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the colors fade from the sky and the first stars begin to prick the darkening canopy. They didn't need to speak of the changes that had occurred. They lived them every day. They saw it in Samuel, who was growing taller and stronger, his world a safe and predictable place of chores and play. They felt it in the easy way they now moved around each other in the small cabin, a dance of two people who had learned each other's rhythms so well they had become one. Inside, visible through the warm, yellow light of the window, Elias's old, heavy sheepskin coat still hung on its peg by the door. It was the coat he had been wearing that first day, the one he had taken off before going back out into the cold, leaving her and Samuel in the warmth. It had not been worn since, replaced by a newer one, but it remained on its hook, a silent relic, a reminder of a beginning forged in desperation and a stranger's unexpected kindness. It was a permanent part of the home now, as much as the hearth or the table, a symbol of the shelter he had offered, and she had accepted. As the last light bled from the world, Lena shifted beside him. She reached out, her movement hesitant at first, then sure, and laid her hand gently on his forearm. It was a simple touch, a quiet question. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. He looked down at her hand, small and capable against the rough sleeve of his shirt, and then he slowly covered it with his own large, calloused one. His grip was warm and firm, an anchor in the vast, quiet darkness. It was an answer. It was a promise. The land held them. The house kept them. And their joined hands spoke of a future built from a